Let us pray. O Lord, we give thanks for the bounty of our province, our land, our resources, and our people. We pledge ourselves to act as good stewards on behalf of all Albertans. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Speaker, today I would like to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly some important visitors to Alberta. They're sitting in the Members Gallery, 27 visiting exchange scholars, scientists, doctors, and graduate students from Alberta's sister provinces in China, Japan, and Korea, from the provinces of Hokkaido, Heilongjiang, and Kangwon. They are here for periods ranging from 1 to 3 years to share their experiences with their Alberta counterparts, to learn things that they can from Alberta, and to become missionaries and friends of their provinces and Alberta. And I'd ask them to stand and receive the welcome of the Assembly.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions.
Dear North.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to give notice of a motion under Standing Order 40. I will be asking that the Legislative Assembly of Alberta extend congratulations to the municipality of Red Deer, which today celebrates its 75th anniversary of incorporation.
Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 11, the Motion Picture Development Amendment Act 1988. This being a money bill, Her Honor, the Honorable Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends the same to the Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the bill is to broaden the mandate of the very successful Motion Picture Development Corporation to permit the corporation to, in addition to providing assistance in the pre-development of films produced in Alberta, to provide equity, minority equity in film productions of Alberta filmmakers. It also provides for an expansion of the amount of capital in the fund from $3 million to $10 million, and it also extends the term of the bill in that the existing legislation would have sunset on March 31st, 1989.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development and Trade has moved first reading of Bill number 11, Motion Picture Development Amendment Act 1988. Those in favor of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill number 11, Motion Picture Development Amendment Act 1988, introduced by Honorable Mr. Shaban, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the response to written question 195, accepted a few short days ago.
Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table the House copies of regulations pursuant to the Nova Corporation of Alberta Act.
Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to members of the Legislative Assembly 50 outstanding students from the Jean Vanier School in Sherwood Park. They are students in grade 5 and 6. They are here with their teachers, Mrs. Howrish and Miss S. Peter, and with parents, Mrs. Flamen, and Mr. Emil Del Orto. They are in the members' gallery, and I would ask if they would rise so that they could receive the very warm welcome of the Legislative Assembly.
Member for St. Albert.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you and through you to all members of the Assembly a group of 84 students from Bertha Kennedy School in St. Albert, grade 6 students, Mr. Speaker. They are accompanied today by their teachers, Mrs. Monica Tikax, Mrs. Beryl Kirkhoven, Mrs. Sandy Kamenko, and parents, Mrs. Joanna DeVries, Mr. Jajarle, Mrs. Carol Jordan, and Mrs. Garno. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we have a special guest that accompanied them, and that's Mrs. Carrie Organ, who is a school trustee for District 3 in St. Albert. And I thank you for coming, Carrie. It's wonderful that you have the commitment to the students to come out and spend the day in the legislature. Mr. Speaker, they're seated in the public galleries. I'd ask that they rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of this assembly.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is well aware that the provincial government recently advanced $12 million in cash to a company owned by Mr. Pocklington and issued a further loan guarantee of $55 million. Mr. Speaker, the ostensible purpose of this loan was for construction of a new hog slaughter plant in southern Alberta. My question to the Premier, does the Premier recall whether the government investigated whether Alberta has a sufficient hog supply to support such a facility before he agreed to the new loans?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the government has an issue of $12 million cash to gainers. As a matter of fact, that will be a loan of some $4 million over 3 years, fully supported and supported by the company at an interest rate of some 9.6%. In terms of the details of that loan and the various parts of our economy that it will support, those are matters that my colleague, the Minister of Economic Development and Trade, handles.
Mr. Speaker, all members, I'm certain, understand that how important it is to have the capability to process our agricultural products in Alberta. And a key export of Alberta in recent years has been pork and beef. And historically, there has been cycles in production of pork. And the packers in Alberta are conscious, as are the producers, of those cycles of production, depending on price and market. The factors involved are many, including the price of grain, the opportunities for marketing processed meat in the United States, as well as the overall pricing regime in North America for red meat. Those are factors that were well taken into account when the package was negotiated with gainers, and our expectation is that a hog slaughtering and processing plant will be constructed in southern Alberta, Mr. Speaker, within the next 2.5 to 3.5 years and in production.
Speaker, back to the Premier. I wish the Premier would start showing some leadership and stop weaseling around on this particular issue, Mr. Speaker. And I want him to tell Albertans, they want to know why one man, Mr. Pocklington, seems to have open sesame to the provincial treasury, the treasury branches, and loan guarantees. Why is this happening?
Mr. Speaker, it's really interesting, the honourable leader of the opposition. I mean, we have loans to Syncrude, made up of Esso, Amoco, Gulf. We have loans to Husky. We have guarantees to a huge Japanese lumber company. We have guarantees to a huge U.S. lumber company, Champion. And what do they complain about when an Alberta company gets a guarantee. Then they're not caring about the Alberta economy. They don't care about jobs for Albertans or processing agricultural products. They're playing cheap politics. That's what they're doing.
Mr. Speaker, there has not been one job created, and there's been $198 million been given out. $198 million of taxpayers' money. How can the Premier justify that?
It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, what the employees at Gaynor said. They said, this means we have a future. This means we can expand. This means Alberta will have this processing. They know who cares about jobs, and it's not that timid bunch across the way.
Whenever the Premier doesn't have an answer, he calls people timid or wimps, Mr. Speaker. That's what they expect from this Premier. No answers, just name-calling, Mr. Speaker. If the Premier's aware, Mr. Speaker, he can talk about all the jobs he wants, but to come back, Alberta presently has a surplus of some 3,000 hogs per month, and this new plant would require at least 20,000 hogs per week or 80,000 per month. Now, my question to the Premier, how is it possible to supply these hogs without closing some other processing facility in the province? Have they talked to the Gaynor's workers about that?
Everybody knows, Mr. Speaker, or should know, that the key in food processing is to make sure that you modernize and expand and process a greater and greater number of units. They should know. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, that they have such a negative outlook of Alberta, that they don't think that our farmers can expand with free trade coming up, new markets into the United States and into the Pacific Rim. We're going to produce those hogs, and we're going to process them, and we're going to make this economy go, and this bunch hate it. It's too positive for them.
Westlock, Sturgeon.
My question is supplemental also to the Premier. I don't think our concern is jobs for Albertans. It's the fact that he has just made one job. He's created a job for one Albertan who's breaking his back hauling the government money to his bank. Would the Premier care to tell the House how much of Mr. Pocklington's bid or purchase of Canberra's foods in Lethbridge of $14 million was financed by the government or the Treasury branches?
Mr. Speaker, I've said yesterday in the House, the government doesn't get involved in the Treasury branch loans. I mean, this is a commercial arrangement made with a financial institution. I mean, I would think the leader of the Liberal Party would be saying, am I ever glad that with the banks withdrawing into Toronto and Montreal, that we have a Treasury branch that's supporting industry in this province, not trying to knock holes in something that's positive. Then they'd rather see things bad. They'd rather see things bad. They loved when prices of oil were down and unemployment was high. Well, that's changed, gentlemen, and you just don't like it, do you? Tough.
Redwater, Andrew.
Mr. Speaker, since the hog producers are in favor of secondary processing industries in this province, a question to the Minister of Agriculture. Could you indicate what the hog production in Alberta is? Is it on the increase or is it decreasing, and any numbers if possible?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to underscore the comments of our Premier, whereby the hog numbers are increasing in this province, whereby the local union endorsed this proposal. The president of the union, John Iwashu, indicated it will create jobs, contrary to what the New Democratic Party is saying. He's president of the local 280P. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we have the endorsement of the hog producers themselves. I have a letter here that says, please be reassured that the board of directors is most pleased about the prospect of having a pork plant in southern Alberta. Mr. Speaker, again, contrary to what the New Democratic Party is saying, our hog numbers are up. We've done an economic analysis to show that it is a very good thing for our hog producers and for the further processing sector in this province. Mr. Speaker, if I could just underscore what the Premier said, whenever there's good news, we've got the bunch opposite who are just not accepting of something that's good for this province.
Speaker, supplementary to the Premier enumerated a very impressive list of various companies that received loans or loans guarantees. Would the Premier consider tabling those kinds of agreements in their finalization in the legislature so that we as the members of the legislature are aware of that complete list or a list that grows as time progresses?
Mr. Speaker, certainly the government has announced them every time, and the members should have an ability to keep a list. In terms of requiring agreements, he should put it on the order paper, and we would see whether there is some competitive nature of a company that might be damaged, and it's always been the custom in the House to make sure that the government does not do something to damage the competitive nature of those organizations. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, that visitors to our legislature would see that the two parties who have almost destroyed the quorum in the House of Commons are now trying to damage it here in Alberta. It is interesting, isn't it, Mr. Speaker?
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to designate my second question the member from Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I had intended to ask my questions to he who can't remember. Instead, I will ask them to he who doesn't know. Mr. Premier, according to the Provincial Treasurer's own speech on page 21, his much-heralded tax cut will save rich families, a family of four earning $100,000, some $438, enough to buy about 6 bags of groceries. However, a family of four earning about $40,000 will save only $183, enough to buy about 2.5 bags of groceries. 6 bags for the rich, 2.5 bags.
Honourable member, that we're now up to 3 sentences. Could we have the question?
Would the Premier tell us what's fair about that?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, as the Provincial Treasurer said when he introduced his budget last night, by far the biggest impact in the tax reductions are for lower-income families. And it's obvious in the documents that were presented in the House. As a matter of fact, the honourable member's own information that he's giving you shows that per $10,000 of earnings, you have a greater percentage of tax relief to the lower income earner. His own figures justify that.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and we even have people living below the poverty line paying taxes and lining up at our food banks for their bags of groceries. Mr. Premier, does the Premier believe that Albertans should be happy that last year his government grabbed $1 billion out of their pockets, about $1,200 per family of four, earning $40,000, and now his budget gives them back $74 million, about $185 for each family? Should Albertans be happy about that?
Mr. Speaker, what Albertans are happy about is the only government in Canada that's reducing their deficit. Reduced their deficit by $2.5 billion. No government in Canada has the guts to do that. And this government has. At the same time, it's turned around the economy. At the same time, it's diversified the economy. And at the same time, it's giving tax benefits back to the people of Alberta while we're supporting Medicare, education, handicap, senior citizens, and social services. That's why the people are happy.
Sure. Isn't that wonderful? Last year we increased taxes and that increased jobs.
Get to the question.
Does the Premier think it's fair that corporations paid 37% of the income taxes collected in this province in the first 5 years of Tory rule? They paid 28.5% in the next 5 years,
13% in the next 5 years, and in the 3 years that we are currently in, the 1986-87 year to the 1988-89 year, they will pay only 4.5% of the income taxes collected in this province.
My goodness. Mr. Speaker, the whole overall corporate tax pot is expanding, sure, and therefore their percentage might go down. But let's remember one other thing. We want profits in our companies because profits mean payrolls and payrolls means jobs, and we're turning this economy around, and he just doesn't like it.
Mr. Speaker, to he who doesn't know, it's the royalty tax credits that are doing the job on the taxpayers of Alberta.
Right.
The flip side of that coin is, Mr. Speaker, that the 3-year average for the, be patient, that the personal income taxes in Alberta for the last 3 years then, for the years 1986-87 to 1988-89, will be 94.5% of the taxes collected in this province. Is that fair to the taxpayers of this province?
Mr. Speaker, one thing the people of Alberta, as I traveled throughout the province, asked us to do, and that was to make sure that we put the financial house in order with good fiscal management and put out a plan to a balanced budget. And we've done it, and Albertans have supported that overwhelmingly. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, they had an opportunity to reflect on this in Chinook recently. They all lost their deposits. Mr. Speaker, I suggest, Mr. Speaker, that they lay off the question to someone who can handle a little better than what we just had from that individual.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Stettler. Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Stettler. Order, please, in the House. Order, please, in the whole House. Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Stettler.
Speaker, thank you. It falls again to me to bring some sense of decorum back to the You get the apple, I'll get the cord. But you can. With respect to a supplemental to the Premier, with respect to fairness to all Albertans, and the fact that the Treasurer announced that the increase to those on social assistance will be $15 a month, a measly $3.50 a week. Does he really think that's fair? $3.50 a week increase in the food allowance to those on social assistance?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government uses certain measurements of what would provide nutritious food allowance to people on social allowance. And the government takes those measurements and then adjusts. In this case, a 13.5% increase. And talking to people who are in the social services area within Alberta recently and this morning, they feel that's a very, very good increase, and they're pleased with it.
Member for Stettler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary through to the Minister of Career Development and Employment. I wonder if he could estimate, in view of the budget announcement of $2.5 billion in new capital expenditures, what that will do in terms of employment in the province.
Mr. Speaker, I'm more than pleased to do that. As we indicated last year, we had one of the biggest capital construction budgets in the history of this province, and it created some 67,000 full-time jobs. Mr. Speaker, that's at $2.8 billion capital construction. This year, with $2.5 billion capital construction, we are still going to see in excess of 60,000 full-time jobs in this province created as a result of that capital budget.
Wow. Main question, Westlock Sturgeon.
My main question is also to the Premier about this great news budget that he had talked about, Mr. Speaker, for the last couple of weeks. It's really a masterpiece in PR, appearing to give something and fudging income, fudging the outgo, and in particular, and I think this is probably most revealing of all, Mr. Speaker, the Executive Council under the Premier is going to have his PR budget increase 38.2%. 38.2% to let us know how well we are. Oh, naturally, when you give nothing, you've got to increase the PR budget. Okay, the first question, read the papers. The first question is with respect to agricultural crop insurance, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has cut the amount of money going into agricultural crop insurance by a third. How does he equate that with the Minister of Environment's forecast that there would be a drought of water, mind you, not a drought of words, that there would be a drought of water over the next year, and we're cutting crop insurance by a third?
Mr. Speaker, the crop insurance system is handled by the Associate Minister of Agriculture. Ask her to respond to the honourable member.
Mr. Speaker,
Sturgeon, the Minister.
you want the answer or not?
Sit down, Shirley. Honourable Minister, you can't ask that question, but please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, the Alberta government covers the cost of the operational cost of the crop insurance program, and we have not, in fact, cut the crop insurance budget. We've maintained the operational and have actually added to that budget. The cut which is shown in the budget document papers is in relation to the high-risk subsidy, and that subsidy has been phased out because everybody is up to the normal coverage level.
Supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if you could figure that one out, you're better than I would, but let's move on to another one to the Premier. The Premier made much, Mr. Speaker, of improvements in health care. Where, or does he intend to, or where is in the budget the reinstatement of insurance for chiropractors, optometrists, physiotherapists, contraceptive counseling? Where in the budget are those reinstatements?
Mr. Speaker, there's been no comment about reinstating those matters, but what the Honourable Leader of the Opposition now appears to want to do is to go into sort of an estimates discussion of the budget. And we have hours and hours and days of time when I would expect him to use that time for those type of questions. I don't think it really is the question period, although if that's the way he wants to use it, I'll try.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting. There just might be a possible reinstatement of that. I didn't realize that, Mr. Speaker. Speaking also, let's move to education, which is supposed to be what Mr. Premier said time and again is the prime emphasis of his government. How can he argue that it's a prime emphasis when in fact the school boards are really going to get just barely over 1% increase, in spite of the fact the budget says 4% by averaging next year? Why didn't they say 10% and averaging next year afterwards, or 20% for 3 years down the road? It's only going to be 1% this year. How can he call that emphasizing education for Albertans?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, it's 4% increase on the school year. Now, I understand the position that the Liberals and the NDP take, Mr. Speaker, and that is you always try and spend faster than inflation. And we've seen what those parties have done in our federal government when they spent faster than inflation. They end up lumping it on to sons and daughters and their sons and daughters, and they say it's all free, and then someday in the future, our children wake up and find that these two parties have put such a debt on their backs that they never, ever will be able to pay it back. That's their kind of budget.
Mr. Speaker, you put the heat on him, and he really does show up that he isn't increasing things. This is to the Premier again in a field that he's familiar with in energy, and taken in context with his earlier statements, Mr. Speaker, about giving the major amounts of guarantees to large corporations. How can he justify increasing the oil sands equity management budget by 343%, over 3 times, or nearly 3.5 times, when at the same time our small producers and our drilling companies, our conventional oil industry, our rig count is going down each month?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, the rig count has been strengthening this year, and the conventional oil industry is doing extremely well in this province, the best anywhere in North America. As a matter of fact, they are able to make the same dollars in the area of, with energy prices at $16 to $18 US as they used to be able to make at $28 US. They like the conditions and they like the incentives, and they're making money and increasing their employment. As far as the Syncrude equity, or the Alberta equity in energy, obviously, Mr. Speaker, we are looking forward to building more and more oil sands plants. There has to be engineering and other work done to prepare for that. We have an interest in those leases, and the funds are there because we believe in the future of the oil sands. We're going to make it happen.
Right on. Supplementary member for Lacombe.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Hospital and Medical Care. Now, on the question of funding in the budget to our medical area and also education, would the Minister advise the House in terms we'd all understand, get away from these percentages that we don't really hook up without the documents in front of us? Would he put it on a per capita basis of what financial support we're giving in the medical field?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the budget documents, while they reflect a 7% increase in the Department of Hospitals and Medical Care, it should be recognized a large portion of that is for the opening of new facilities, including the Millwoods Hospital in Edmonton, the Peter Lougheed Hospital in Calgary, and the Lethbridge Hospital. With respect to expenditures, as the budget documents indicated, we're approaching, when you consider the department that I'm responsible for, occupational and community health, and the health side of the social services department, we're approaching $4,000 per family in Alberta, or about $1,400 per person.
Member for Little Bow.
Supplementary question to the Minister of Associate Minister of Agriculture with regards to the crop insurance premium. Could the Minister indicate what effect that change of policy will have with regards to subsidies, I guess, from the government in terms of the farmer's premium? What effect that will have in terms of the farmer's premium payment in this upcoming crop year?
Mr. Speaker, it will not affect the overall farmers' payments on crop insurance because it only applied to a few farmers in the first place who were in a specific area which had drought conditions as opposed to the rest of the province. So it won't affect individual payments.
Main question, member for Little Bow, followed by the member for St. Paul, then the member for Edmonton Calder.
Mr. Speaker, my question was to the provincial treasurer, but I can direct it to the premier. Generally, the budget presented last night, I accept the principles. I feel it was rather a good job under difficult circumstances. The pursuit of the balancing of the budget, the reduction of the deficit, very positive. My question, though, to the premier, it relates to page 25 of the budget, and there's an item there that is not dealt with in terms of future policy of the government, and that will be the accumulated deficit of some $6 billion. Could the Premier indicate what would be the plan of the government following the fiscal year 1990-1991 when the budget is finally balanced and we have this budget baggage that has to be dealt with in an overall expenditure program?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's the intention of the government, obviously, to reduce the accumulated deficit as rapidly as possible. And we are building into all of our plans exactly that action. Of course, when the honourable member and I are talking about 1990-91, obviously neither of us can predict the future clearly that far out into the future, but it's the government's intent to reduce that accumulated deficit as rapidly as possible.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Premier. With regards to our current AAA credit rating, what does an accumulated deficit such as that have in terms of effect on that rating, if any?
I believe, Mr. Speaker, that it is AA, the rating for the province. Frankly, with the Alberta Heritage Trust Fund, with the lowest debt servicing costs anywhere in Canada, Alberta's credit rating and the way that financial institutions, both in Canada and throughout the world, look at Alberta's debt and the paper that or bonds and debentures that we wish to distribute. They seek them out very aggressively, and we are able to be the most favored debt instruments in Canada.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. It's with regards to priorities. In terms of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, we have taken the earnings and put it into general revenue, as well as any other potential redirected non-renewable resource revenue. Would the Premier indicate which would be the higher priority of government, to deal with this accumulated deficit or to reinstate some of the funds to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund?
Mr. Speaker, it would be a balance of those. Obviously, once we have a balanced budget, we would then want to consider very much continuing to once again grow, have the Heritage Trust Fund grow with a portion of our non-renewable resources. But when you're in a period of time when you are borrowing, it doesn't make very much sense to go and borrow money in order to put some money into the Heritage Trust Fund. But we would certainly want to, as soon as we have a balanced budget, once again start to put some portion back into allowing the Heritage Trust Fund to grow.
Leader of the Opposition, followed by Westlock Sturgeon.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. And this next year, and it ties into long term, of course, so they're based on $18.50 a barrel of oil. Now, Mr. Speaker, most observers think this is somewhat optimistic. My question is, because this is so important in the discussion that we're having, what was these figures based on, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as everyone knows, trying to predict the price of oil is an extremely difficult matter. As a matter of fact, normally, if you pick a price, probably the odds are you won't hit it exactly at all. However, the government of Alberta, the Minister of Energy, the provincial treasurer, myself, do get information and talk to people all over the world who are as knowledgeable as possible on energy pricing. And, of course, we have the Energy Resources Conservation Board, the Department of Energy, we have the Petroleum Marketing Commission. All of them also monitor oil prices. We think $18.50 is a good figure. It may well be stronger because there are more and more people starting to say now that they're looking at a quicker escalation in prices in the future. Everybody has their own judgment, but I want to point this out to the Leader of the Opposition. As well as the price of oil, remember the tremendous benefits flowing to our province because of increased markets for natural gas. An all-time record sale of natural gas in the United States, and into this year, into 1988, that is growing even more. So we are looking, Mr. Speaker, to that as well. Remember, we're diversifying this economy. So it's not just that oil base any longer. It's the forestry side, the technology side, the huge growth in tourism. Now, this is a much stronger economy now, and I don't think you'll find that the oil price is going to be the single factor it has been in the past.
Sturgeon.
Speaker, again, to the Premier, supplementary to what the honourable member for Little Bow started, with the preoccupation of this government, Mr. Speaker, in reducing the deficit and the difficulty, as the Premier's already outlined, in forecasting the price of oil, and bearing in mind that our Canadian dollar going up also decreases what we receive for oil. But bearing in mind that we might miss quite considerably on the low side on the oil estimate, would he give his guarantee to this legislature and through us to the people of Alberta that he will not cut any of the programs that have already been set forward in the budget if indeed oil prices look like they drop?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's typical of the honourable member that the first thing he does is pick the drop. As I said, we estimate what we think will be right. The odds are that we may well as much be conservative in the price of oil as that we are being too aggressive. It was indicated from our budget when we had the large deficit that the one thing this government is determined to do is to continue to make sure that the people programs in Alberta are supported. And that's why we have the best people programs in Canada.
Main question, member for St. Paul, followed by Edmonton Calder, and then Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to direct my question to the Associate Minister of Agriculture with regards to her responsibilities for Alberta hail and crop insurance. Last year, due to severe drought conditions in northeast Alberta, there were inadequate forage supplies. If any action has been taken to improve the situation for these farmers since they were not eligible for the Livestock Feed Security Program.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would be pleased to respond to the member's question. There's only north of Highway 16, basically, were the farmers in Alberta unable to obtain the forage crop benefits or the forage protection program. And there was indeed an area in northeastern Alberta which was very, very dry and did have short feed supplies. We made a decision earlier this year, which I announced towards the end of January, that we would expand the forage program to the entire province so that the farmers in northeastern Alberta have the option of making a decision about whether they want to protect their forage supplies or not.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly pleased to hear that they will be eligible for the program. Is there a deadline for application, and what is the date?
Mr. Speaker, there is indeed a deadline for the application. It's March the 31st. The Crop Insurance Corporation has sent out notices and pamphlets to all agricultural producers so that they are aware of the extension of the program and the deadline for application.
Second supplementary, Mr. Speaker, since the program will be new in that area, will the minister consider extending the deadline should it be necessary?
If there's a problem, Mr. Speaker, I certainly would take that into consideration. My understanding is that it has been highly publicized and there really shouldn't be any problem.
Member for Vegreville.
In terms of the serious drought in northeastern Alberta, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of the Environment if he's had time to consider the suggestion I made to him in the letter last week about reinstating the very useful drought assistance program run through his department during the last drought, which helped people whose water supplies, both for domestic and livestock purposes, were lost due to drought. Will he consider reinstating that program?
Mr. Speaker, the suggestion put forward by the member from Vegreville is under review, but I think, having had a question asked, I think it's important to point out that we've just come out of the 13th warm, drying winter in a row. And we've got a very difficult situation facing Alberta through 1988, as it appears to be. In addition to having 13 now cumulative years of a warm, drying trend, we've also got the second lowest snowpack in the Rocky Mountains in the last 20 years. So the efforts of the government through 1988 will be addressed to all aspects of water shortage and drought in the whole province of Alberta, and all of my colleagues will be working together to deal with that matter.
Member for Edmonton Calder, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark. Cypress Redcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions are to the Minister of Social Services. Many mentally ill persons receive the assured income for the severely handicapped from the Department of Social Services. Due to a recent policy change, the department now has a regulation stating that if a person is admitted into a hospital for treatment, their benefits are cut off after 30 days. However, Mr. Speaker, if you go on a holiday, you can receive AISH income up to 6 months. Can the Minister explain this outrageous policy which encourages holidaying and discourages treatment?
Mr. Speaker, there is always difficulty in our various programs in assessing whether someone is going to be in a treatment facility in a short, medium, or longer term, and at the same time when that individual has to keep up a home that they may potentially go back to, some judgments have to be made. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we have lengthened, as a result of concerns that were raised with me earlier in the winter, that we have lengthened the amount of time now allowed, but I will get that information and report back to the honourable member.
Supplementary to the Minister, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister not recognize that this policy results in patients leaving institutions before they are ready without having received full treatment for fear of having their benefits cut off and losing their homes? And will she change this policy?
Mr. Speaker, I believe I just answered the question, and the honourable member hopefully will consider the answer before reading the standard question that she has outlined. It's for those very reasons that I reviewed the policy earlier this winter, and that we did lengthen the time. I'll report back to the honourable member as to how long that is.
Mr. Speaker, if there's been an extension, social workers are unaware of that policy change. Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, there are some other problems with the AISH program as well. The Minister is surely aware that some AISH recipients are living in slum housing. Why is this Minister not taking responsibility to ensure that taxpayers' money is being spent on adequate housing rather than unfit slum housing?
Mr. Speaker, it has not been the habit of the Department of Social Services and individual workers to intervene in the lives of people and say to them that they must not live in certain places. I think it is fair to say that certainly our workers would encourage people when they see them in circumstances that they believe could be improved to make those suggestions. But in the end, individuals will determine where it is they're going to live.
That's right.
Well, final supplementary to the Minister then. Is the Minister saying then that even though taxpayers' money is going to directly funding the slum housing, that she sees her department having no responsibility other than providing those funds to those people?
Tell them where to spend it.
Mr. Speaker, it is always a balance to judge how far government walks into people's lives. It is our judgment that we must supply basic living support dollars in order for people to be able to look after themselves. But if the honourable member is suggesting that beyond that, that social workers and others get into dictating precisely how that money will be spent by individuals, no, Mr. Speaker, we have not done that.
Member for Dunvegan and followed by Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister of Social Services how we compare in Alberta with other provinces in the AISH program.
You will want to hear this, Ray. You will want to hear this.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that when trying to provide information through the legislative question period that relates to the full context of the discussion, and certainly I think it's important that looking at how taxpayers are supporting the system in Alberta is an important one to do within the legislature. Surely if the taxpayers are supporting a program, just as the honourable member for Edmonton Calder has just questioned, that they understand how well they are doing in relationship to the rest of the country. Mr. Speaker, there is not another pension program like this in the rest of the country. There is means testing in other jurisdictions that certainly doesn't allow for individuals to be on a pension instead of on some form of social allowance.
Edmonton Goldbar.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary to the Minister. Will the food allocation increase spoken to yesterday in the budget be given to AISH recipients as well? They are already calling to find out the answer to that question.
Mr. Speaker, the food allowance that was spoken to is one that only relates to the social allowance category. And as well, there was recognition of that given to the foster parents who obviously have taken on a great responsibility with respect to children and government care. The AISH pension is a global figure, Mr. Speaker, and we do not have specific categories within it.
Member for Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a fundamental difference between a public relations budget based on the luck of the oil revenues draw and a substantive vision for the long-term economic development of this province. Important elements are missing. Diversification. How can the Premier claim a true commitment to diversification and then reduce funding to the Economic Development Department, the one department charged with promoting small business, a key element in the diversification of this province?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member should know, I would think, that the real people who make an economy diversified is the private sector. The government assists and establishes the climate, and that's what we're going to do.
That's right. So you admit reduced assistance to the real people who diversify this province. Free trade. How can his government place so much public relations emphasis on free trade and its benefits for small business and leave unchanged total funding for trade development, export services, market development, and product development?
Again, Mr. Speaker, he's following along the same pattern as his leader, I hope. His leader, that he's doing an estimates exercise during the question period. The matters that he's raising are within the budget of the Minister of Economic Development and Trade. He can deal with them in his estimates, or he can take the time now, I guess, and I'd refer that to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade.
Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions? Opposed?
Mr. Speaker, I'd be really pleased to deal with the specifics of the items referred to by the honourable member in the budget of the Department of Economic Development and Trade. He mentioned a couple, export services, and as a matter of fact, there is a provision for the reinstatement of the Export Services Support Program, which was to have sunsetted in the current year. There's also an expansion through the creation of a new modified management assistance program to assist small and medium-sized companies to access the export market. One of the reasons we've been able to reduce some of the expenses in the department is to draw increasingly upon the federal programs such as PEMD to support our small businesses and assist them in accessing these federal programs. Another initiative, Mr. Speaker, will be to reduce the support to companies who have previously received support for trade missions on a number of occasions and try to provide support to newer companies. So we're pretty excited about the capability in our budget to respond to the export opportunities, and I look forward to discussing it with the member during the discussion of the estimates.
Public relations mastery, Mr. Speaker. Trade and investment development is reduced so that export services support can be increased. Nils out. No improvement. Small business capital funding, another important element of diversification. How can the government claim support for balanced economic growth and then reduce funding to the Alberta Opportunity Company, which is an important source of capital funding for small business in this province?
Mr. Speaker, when one examines all of the initiatives for business development, one should focus as well upon the available support in the Department of Technology, Research and Telecommunications, and the Department of Tourism, and in other departments. Selective memory loss by the honourable member seems rather convenient, and I think members are well familiar with that penchant of the honourable member.
What about the small manufacturers in Brooks and Hanna and Lloydminster? The Premier has increased his own public relations budget by 38% while reducing emphasis on small business support. When is this government, and this is to the Premier, Mr. Premier, when is this government going to stop emphasizing public relations and start doing his job for balanced economic growth through small business development in this province.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the honourable member is talking about the Bureau of Public Affairs, and the large increase in there is to capitalize on the tremendous job that Calgary did with the Olympics, supported by all Albertans. And it opened the eyes of the world to this province. Now we are following up on that with a world awareness program to make sure that we can capitalize on the benefits of the Olympics. That's those dollars all over the world, selling Alberta to the world, because we're determined to diversify. And our tourism is booming, and we're using this to attract people and investment, and we're flowing $50 million into the tourism industry through lotteries. We have $1.5 billion in forestry. I think it was $200 million in the previous 20 years. $1.5 billion, making that forestry resource an important part of diversification in this province. The technology benefits. So that, Mr. Speaker, when the honourable member is talking about growth in this province's economy, we're talking not just agriculture and energy. They are important, and they're both going to be stronger and stronger in the future, but also forestry, also technology and research, also services, Mr. Speaker, also tourism. There's a tremendous economy growing here, and you just watch it, because we're doing the job for Albertans.
Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For all the Premier's bragging, the fact is that every economic department has been cut, and we've been making large handouts to various organizations that he was just bragging about today all over the province. Why, Mr. Speaker, why, Mr. Premier, don't you bring those plans for your economic activities in this province into this Assembly and have them debated properly and fully, instead of suggesting that you might, well, people should be able to keep lists.
Question's been made.
Well, I don't know what kind of gibberish that was, Mr. Speaker. Here's the budget. The documents are here. They're going to be debated. I know, come back to it, how much they dislike the success story that's going on in this province. How they just can't stand the fact that the economy has turned around and rebounding so strongly. They can't stand the diversification that's happening. They can't stand the benefits flowing to Albertans from jobs and a stronger and stronger economy. So let's hear all about his concerns as the debate goes on, but don't claim that we aren't debating it in this legislature. That's nonsense.
Calgary Northwest.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade, could the Minister tell us what percentage of the expenditure in last year's budget pertained to developing the infrastructure to develop this department that's now up and working well?
Mr. Speaker, a certain portion of the budget each year is for extraordinary measures, and that's why it's difficult to compare year-to-year percentages. We have, however, as I indicated earlier, been able to trim expenses in certain areas such as hosting and entertainment in order to continue to achieve a high level of service to the small business community, but at the same time reduce the overall spending.
Orders of the day. Might we revert briefly?